Well, shortly afterwards, of course, he was there when Stephen was stoned. And also I would disagree about the extra-biblical data. I think we do have extra-biblical data for most everything. I will say that everything on that factual list that I gave, everything except probably the despair of the disciples, which is a good psychological fact, but all the rest of them can be established through Paul alone. But I think the majority of them can also be witnessed to in ancient extra-biblical literature.
Now, the discussion that you just listened to is typical of conversations between Christians and non-Christians concerning the question, did Jesus really rise from the dead? Non-Christians usually claim there's not enough historical evidence. There are no eyewitness testimonies, and the Gospels were written long after Jesus lived by those who didn't even know Jesus. Further, they say there is no evidence from secular or non-Christian sources that substantiate the historical outline about Jesus as found in the Gospels. They then conclude, how is it that if Jesus was so important, we don't even know the birth date of Jesus, nor when he was crucified? Well, concerning this last question, I talked with Dr. Darrell Bach, professor of New Testament at Dallas Theological Seminary. Listen.
Peter Jennings opened his special by saying, we suspected that reliable sources would be hard to come by. And he said that not only are there reliable sources hard to come by, he said there's a lack of evidence concerning Jesus' life in terms of the historical Jesus. Is that true?
No, not really. There actually is quite a bit of historical evidence, especially considering how obscure at one level a figure Jesus was. He was tucked away in a rural part of the Roman Empire, and as he was tucked away in that rural part, in the context of a vast empire, one would think you would know very little about him, but in fact he pops up in a whole lot of places.
A lot of people say that there are no secular, non-Christian sources about Jesus that confirm the historical facts that are found in the New Testament. Is that true or false?
No, that's false. We have several sources outside the Bible that confirm the existence of Jesus, and they say very important things about Jesus.
Such as?
We have Tacitus, who says that Pontius Pilate was responsible for the execution. That's a Roman historian talking about a Roman governor. We have Josephus, a Jewish historian, saying Pontius Pilate is responsible for the execution of Jesus, and our people put him up to it. So that's a Jewish historian talking about the Jewish contribution to the discussion. We have Jewish sources that talk about Jesus as a magician and sorcerer, acknowledging that he did unusual works. That's something that Josephus also tells us. So not only do we have corroboration, in some cases we have double corroboration.
Now, concerning the question, when was Jesus born? Most historians have concluded Jesus was born before April of 4 BC. Why? Well, in Matthew 2:1 and Luke 1:5, we are told Jesus was born while Herod the Great was still living. And according to Matthew 2:15, Herod died while Jesus was less than 2 years old. On the basis of Roman records, historians have calculated Herod's death occurred in 4 BC. Why? Well, Josephus records an eclipse of the moon the year that Herod died. That eclipse has been dated by astronomers as happening March 12th of 4 BC. Josephus also tells us that the Passover occurred in 4 BC, soon after Herod's son Archelaus assumed the kingship. Well, historians know that the Passover occurred on April 17th of that year. If we pull all these facts together, since Jesus was born before Herod died, the evidence shows Jesus must have been born before April 4 BC, or possibly a short time before, around 5 BC. Now, concerning the next question, how accurate are the 4 Gospels? And were any of them written by eyewitnesses? I'd like you to listen to a clip from our program with Dr. John Warwick Montgomery, a man who holds 2 PhDs and is a practicing trial attorney.
The first gospel was written by Matthew Levi, a tax collector, who became an apostle, a disciple of Jesus, and who wrote on the basis of his own observation of what Jesus said and did. The fourth gospel was written by John, who was the youngest of the disciples and lived the longest. We have independent evidence that he died in the city of Ephesus around the year 95. We have records of 2 of his students, where they indicate to us that John was in fact the author of that book, and he passed on information to them about the authorship of the other major Gospels. The second Gospel was written by John Mark, who was a companion of Peter, one of the apostles, and Luke's Gospel was written by the physician who accompanied the Apostle Paul on his missionary journeys. And Paul was accepted by the original 11 apostles as a legitimate apostle in his own right.
And then, of course, you've got James and Peter.
Those as well.
That's right. So you have 7 eyewitnesses that said they were either there or checked out other witnesses and gave us information, which is what we have in the New Testament. But then I can hear many of the folks that are listening in right now, they would be saying, but Dr. Montgomery, you know those were all the disciples of Jesus. Those were his friends. Didn't they pad the case? I mean, didn't they really kind of make it up and lift Jesus up? And we really don't have any skeptics in the group there. We just have good friends of Jesus. How do we know that they actually are telling us the truth about what Jesus actually did?
That's one of the central questions, and it seems to me we need to face that directly. And there are 2 things we need to see about it. First of all, these people did not start out as believers. In fact, after Jesus' crucifixion, they were back at the old fishing nets. They quite obviously had not arrived at the belief reflected in the writings that they produced later. What changed their minds was the resurrection itself. We see this in the case of Thomas, who wouldn't believe unless he could touch the nail prints in Jesus' hands and thrust his hand into his side after the resurrection. That's the first thing. Second thing is, it doesn't really make any difference whether a writer about Jesus or a writer about anything else is a friend of the person that he writes about if he produces his writings in an environment where there are hostile witnesses. The fact is that the early apostles went out and presented what we have in the New Testament in a primarily Jewish audience, particularly in the synagogues. And the Jewish religious leaders had been the primary opponents of Jesus' message. Now, it is inconceivable that the disciples, friends of Jesus or not, could have gotten away with incorrect information about Jesus in the presence of hostile witnesses who had themselves had contact with Jesus' life and who had what we lawyers call means, motive, and opportunity to destroy that picture.
You are listening to The John Ankerberg Show, featuring leading historians, theologians, and archaeologists as they present the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead.
Therefore, the historian, whether that historian be a secularist, a Muslim, a Christian, whatever, the historian has to say, how do we explain the fact that this movement spread like wildfire with Jesus as the Messiah, even though Jesus had been crucified? And the answer has to be, it can only be because he was raised from the dead.
Well, in terms of the psychological profile of the disciples, if we believe that it is true that they denied, deserted, and betrayed Jesus, that they had given him up for lost when he died on the cross, psychologically, something significant had to have happened to change all of their minds about this particular issue after the crucifixion of Jesus.
Now, wait a minute. I'm using your facts. You don't believe the conclusion. What's this missing X? What do you think really happened? They usually at that point will opt out of the discussion any way they can. But if they do take a naturalistic theory, my assertion is the known historical facts, those admitted by all scholars, are sufficient to refute those naturalistic theories, as well as give the best evidence.
Now we're examining the historical records of Jesus' life to see if we can discover if the evidence shows Jesus actually rose from the dead. At the beginning of this program, Dr. Gary Habermas referred to 12 historical facts that virtually all critical scholars in the world today accept. I asked him to share what those facts are with you. Listen.
Most scholars will give you a list of facts surrounding the events that Christians call the gospel: the trial, the death, the burial, the resurrection of Jesus. I think there are at least 12 facts, at least 12. I mean, the vast majority of scholars will give you more than these, but there are at least 12 facts that critical scholars admit. Virtually every scholar will admit virtually every one of these. 1, Jesus died by crucifixion. 2, he was buried. Nothing strange about these things. Most people die, most people are buried. 3, his death caused the disciples to despair and lose hope, believing his life had ended. What would you say if your best friend died and very suddenly? 4, now I admit this one is not as widely held, but many scholars believe that the tomb in which Jesus was buried was discovered to be empty just a few days later. 5, The disciples had experiences, and I'll say this the way that even the critics will be able to accept it, I think. The disciples had experiences which they believed were literal appearances of the risen Jesus. They thought Jesus appeared to them. 6, because of these experiences, they were transformed from doubters. They were afraid of their own shadow, so to speak, certainly afraid to identify themselves with Jesus, into bold proclaimers of his death and resurrection. 7, this message was the center of preaching in the early church. Remember, Paul said, of first importance, death, burial, resurrection of Jesus. 8, this message was especially proclaimed in the environs of Jerusalem, where Jesus died and was buried just shortly before. 9, as a result of this preaching,